complete an activity, and that becomes an activity matrix. The resource becomes an activity matrix, and we looked at the same problem through one example. Sorry. We looked at flow rate of cookie baking process. We also looked at the process capacity. And we started with inventory. We looked at what really is inventory. We looked at what are some of the reasons for carrying inventory. We looked at classifications based on different reasons. There is pipeline inventory, cycle inventory, anticipation inventory, safety stock inventory. We looked at inventory classification based on stages. That's raw material, work in progress, and finished goods. We looked at how we could identify different types of inventory and how different businesses could have the same inventory but in completely different formats. We looked at inventory in service businesses and how, while it might appear that their entire revenue or their entire business is through services, but we saw that hospitals still carry as much as 40% of inventory. We looked at how we could prioritize attention. So we looked at how a small number of items typically account for majority of the costs. That's really the Pareto principle. We looked at ABC classification of inventory. We looked at a problem. And this is where we kind of ended last class on how much inventory to keep. We looked at management of dependent demand inventory, independent demand inventory, and we looked at what are some of the considerations when we would really look to stock some of the items in our houses. And we saw that it's pretty much the same for some of our most of our organizations as well. It's a set of very similar attributes and traits that we have to look at. We looked at the cost of inventory for businesses, and where we had stopped was how much to order and what to order, which we were looking at, which we will start with from today, which is really the economic order quantity. We had, I think, touched on economic order quantity, but we never really went into details. All right, let me just quickly open the presentation for today. So this will probably be our last session for this topic. We'll move into a different topic on the next session, and we will focus on the remainder of the classes on that. Let's see how much we are able to complete today. If not, it might spill over for a bit in the next session. So let's really look at economic order quantity, and let's try and understand why is it important. And let's really focus, like I've always maintained, let's really focus on the concept itself. There are a lot of assumptions which this model or this concept carries, which might not be extremely practical in the real sense of the word. But having said that, if we are able to stick to some of the thought process which goes into building this model, it will give us a fairly good indication of when to order and how much to order per se. All right. So remember, we were focusing on the independent demand items, items that a company would purchase from a supplier that's coming from outside. So it's not dependent on the consumption within the organization, but from outside. And typically, how much to order is based on a model that's what we call as an economic order quantity. So how much to order is based on this particular model. This is a model for calculating the amount of inventory in terms of how much you want to order. Now, this model is based on the principle of trading off two different costs. So there are two different costs which we have to trade off. to be able to understand understand the concept of economic order quantity in a much better way. One of them is the ordering cost, the other is the holding cost. So when we talk about the cost of ordering, you are actually thinking about, you remember the example which we gave about the grocery store. When we are looking at the cost of ordering, you're thinking about the trip to the grocery store, the cost of the time that you're spending to the grocery store, the cost of petrol or gas that you might be consuming to the grocery store. And for a company, it might be, maybe order processing costs, it might be the cost of transportation, cost of getting a truckload, and that might be the fixed cost. Whether you get a full truckload or a quarter truckload, it might be a fixed cost based on that. So you would get counted under your cost of ordering all of these items, and it's based on the number of orders you will have in a year, and you're going to have an annual ordering cost from that. The other cost that companies are principally concerned, and that gets incorporated into the economic order quantity model, is the cost of holding inventory. So when you are actually holding some items or stocks in your warehouse, that typically also entails an amount of cost, and it's really a trade-off between the ordering cost and holding cost, and whichever is less is by common sense you should actually prefer. So if you think about the cost of finance that's being invested in the inventory, the insurance that you're paying on that warehouse, the opportunity cost of that space in your warehouse, all of those things are typically figured into the holding cost for an inventory. And when you think about the economic order quantity model, the ECQ, what you will see is that you are trying to trade off two different costs. And we are going to talk about ECQ in a little more detail, but we are going to focus from the lens of how much to order, because there are so many different connotations to ECQ and so many different applications where ECQ finds its use in. But we are really going to be focusing on how much to order. When to order, we will look at something called as a reorder point. I don't think we'll be able to get to that today, but let's really start with how much to order, and it's going to be based on when the inventory reaches a certain level, and there's going to be a point, this reorder point, that will be determined based on some analysis that we'll do, perhaps in the next class, when we reach a certain level of inventory, and that's when you place an order. The question we are trying to address in this particular session or this lesson today is how much to order, and that's going to be your economic order quantity. All right. So the first thing you might want to get an understanding of is the trade-off between ordering and holding cost. You have to think about it from a perspective of annual quantity that is being ordered. So in a year, how much of quantity is being ordered? And if you order in smaller batches or smaller quantities, you are going to order many more times to have the same amount of annual quantity. You will order more frequently and you will have many more orders. So if you have a fixed ordering cost, your annual ordering cost will be very high because of you've ordered many times. So you have ordered n number of times. If it's like 15 times in a year or 18 times in a year, that will typically be a part of your ordering cost. Now contrast this idea with the having the idea of ordering a large quantity at a single time. And there, in this example, in this time of the year, you've ordered only maybe say 2 times in a year, in this particular example here. And if this was 6 months worth typically inventory you're holding, so your annual ordering cost is going to be based on just 2 orders, and it's going to be relatively small compared to the first case. However, the cost of holding inventory, the cost of how much of investment you're going to have in that inventory, how much of risk you're taking about inventory getting obsolete or things getting spoiled, or there is some kind of pilferage or loss or theft that's going on, is going to be much higher because you are buying 6 months worth of inventory at a time. So the idea of ordering costs, and this is the idea of ordering costs and holding costs, and you can get some sense of the trade-off between these two costs. And that's what we are going to use in order to derive what we called as an ECQ, in order to calculate what is that number, what is that economic order quantity. And the economic order quantity model is based on certain assumptions. It's a very simple model at its core, but whenever you have a simple model, you definitely will have some restrictive assumptions that are simplifying it in order to get the calculations done quickly. So let's really look at what are some of the assumptions. Assumptions here in when we talk about economic order quantity. Okay, that's what we are assuming here. However unrealistic it might be in real life, and we've got an assumption that that assuming all demand is met, and that you are never telling a customer that you don't have enough. So all demand is being met. We are assuming a lead time of 0 at this point, right? Um, but when we get to the reorder point, we'll talk about incorporating the lead time in the reorder point itself. But for ECQ, we are assuming a lead time of 0. So there is an instantaneous replenishment. You place an order, you get the quantity delivered to you right on the same day. So you are never worried about inventory running short. The setup cost is fixed regardless of the quantity you order. So again, whether it's unrealistic or not, what we are saying here is every time you place an order, you incur a particular amount of a fixed cost. Whether that order for a very small quantity or for a very large quantity, the cost of ordering is going to be based on simply the fact that you placed an order. So it's the cost per order. The unit price is constant over the years. So it's the period you are calculating the economic order quantity, and the unit price remains constant throughout, say, the particular duration. So if it's 1 year or if it's 5-year time period, the unit price remains constant, and we are starting off with a model that does not involve any discounts of any sort. So the unit price will remain constant throughout this case. Again, let's take these assumptions with a pinch of salt. These things usually don't happen in real life, but it's important for us to understand the logic and the concept behind ECQ, and to be able to use some of the concepts presented in a much more smarter way. All right. Let's work towards coming up with an economic order quantity here in this particular case. And let's try and see what will be the ECQ. So we've said that it's a constant demand rate. On the x-axis, you have time. And on the y-axis, you have quantity that's being ordered. All right? Okay. So when you have a constant demand rate and an annual demand of D, your average inventory that you will have to have at any point is the in time is going to be based on Q divided by 2. So if you are ordering Q at a time, your inventory is going to be Q divided by 2. Simply because you start off with Q, it goes down to 0. Starting and ending inventory are Q and 0, and the average is really Q divided by 2. All right. So the next thing you would want to see is the time between these two orders, and it's going to be determined by the quantity you order.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yeah.
Sir, that Q divided by 2 will be that Q will be on the monthly basis of the order or the yearly basis.
So in this particular time, in this particular case, it could be the unit of time that you have taken for computation. It could be a per month, it could be per week, it could be per quarter. That's irrespective. So this unit of time will be for a particular. So if you are talking about computing your inventory for 1 month, then this will be Q divided by 2 per month. It could be for a year, it could be for a week. It really depends on your computations per se.
Okay, sir.
All right. So the next thing you would want to see here is that time between orders is going to be determined by the quantity that you order every time you place an order, um, divided by the annual demand, or D. So this is what I'm talking about. So when you are talking about the time, so it's determined. You want to see that the time between orders, and it's going to be determined by the quantity Q you order every time and you place and divided by the annual demand D here. That's because we want to come to something called as the number of orders in a year. So if we are actually considering it in a particular time frame, and when we are saying in this particular case, to answer your question, let's assume it's for a year as such. So when we are calculating the number of orders in a year, 1 second, let's move on to the next one. The number of orders in a year is going to be based on the annual demand. That's the entire annual demand for the whole year divided by the quantity that you order every time you place an order. So simply stated, it's saying that if you have an annual demand of maybe 1,000 units and you order say 2,000 at one particular, in one slot or in one batch or in one order, you are basically ordering 5 times in a year. If you have an annual demand, once again, if you have an annual demand of 10,000 units and you order 2,000 at a time, you're basically ordering 5 times in a year. So that's the number of orders is 5 in a year based on 10,000 being the annual demand and 2,000 being the order that you order every time you place an order. So that's reflecting, this picture is reflecting the assumption of the fact that there is an instantaneous replenishment, there is a constant demand rate, and we are keeping these assumptions constant while moving forward. All right. So before we get to the concept of ECQ and get to the formula of ECQ, let's take the perspective of ordering costs and holding costs as being the only two costs that we have, and calculate what will be the annual cost of managing the inventory in this case. So we are keeping the cost of the item aside. We are not taking that into account. So we are not taking whatever is the cost of the item, say it's a pen or whatever it is. We are not really taking that into account. We are simply looking at the total cost of managing the inventory. So if you look at the total cost of managing the inventory, it's going to be two components. One of them is going to be ordering costs. So what you need is the number of orders, right? So the number of orders would be, you need the number of orders in a year, and the number of orders in a year is going to be determined by the annual demand divided by the quantity you order every time. Like we said, 10,000 divided by 2,000 in this particular, in that example which we thought about, and it's going to give you an annual cost of ordering. Now, on the other hand, you need your holding cost. Your holding cost is going to be determined by how much you hold at any point of time. All right. So your average inventory is Q by 2 is going to determine your holding cost. So the ordering cost is going to come from the numbers of orders. So that's one component, and the other component is your holding cost, and that's going to be determined by the average inventory that's being held based on the fact that you're ordering Q at every point of time. All right. So if you were to take those two components and try to come up with a total cost, you have the total number of orders in a year. You multiply that with the cost of ordering every time you place an order, and that we call as S here, because S stands for ordering costs or setup costs. Just remember, S would stand for ordering costs or setup costs. It could be setting up your machinery to make an item, in which case you are going to call it your setup cost. It could be the setup cost of your supplier, in which case you are going to use the setup costs as the cost of ordering. And on the other side, you are going to have the holding rate. So that's going to be like an interest rate, and that's going to be calculated like an interest rate. It's going to have some more components than simply the investment. It's going to have a component of how much percentage do you expect to be added for the product to get spoiled, to get obsolete. There is some pilferage or some kind of stealing that might happen. So all of those sorts might go into that holding rate, and it will give you a total cost of holding inventory and ordering inventory, coming up with a total cost of your inventory management as such. All right. Little scary looking graph, but it's actually very simple. So if you take these two costs and you look at the two trade-offs between two costs, that's what's being represented on the picture here. On the x-axis, you have the order quantity, and as the order quantity goes from left to right, you have the order quantity, and as the order quantity goes from left to right, as it increases, so the more you order at one time, the holding cost, the straight line going from left to right and diagonals is your holding cost. That increases the more you order at a time. At the same time, the cost of ordering or the cost of setup go down, and that's the curve that's going down from left to right. Showing the setup cost is going to be less if you order more at a time, simply because you have fewer orders. And the total cost curve, which is a combination of both the holding and setup costs, is the total cost of the combination of those two, giving you a total cost based on adding up both of these. So the optimal quantity Q star is what you would want. Uh, and it's the quantity at which your total cost is going to be an absolute minimum. And there's going to be a unique minimum for this in terms of a total cost. And that unique minimum of total cost is going to come from an optimal inventory Q star, which can be computed based on the ECQ formula, which we will be looking at in the next slide. All right. No need to memorize this formula. Just try and understand a little bit of what's mentioned here. Its ECQ or Q star is the square root of your total demand or annual demand times your ordering cost. Multiply that by 2 and divide that by the holding cost and take the square root. That gives you ECQ. Once you have your ECQ that's given to you by Q star, your total annual cost using the ECQ can be calculated by a formula that you have on the bottom of the screen. That's square root of 2 times the annual demand times the setup cost for every time you place an order times the holding rate that you will have for your item. So that way you'll be calculating the total cost if you were using your ECQ. So just remember the thing for Q star, and whenever you are whenever you're asked about total costs, this would be the formula. So don't worry, we'll be actually looking through one example and trying to understand this formula in a little more detail. But before we do that, let's really understand a little bit more about the square roots in ECQ. What are some of these implications? Okay. So you see in the ECQ formula, so this is the ECQ formula, 2ds divided by h square root. D is the annual requirement, S is the setup cost, H is the holding cost in this particular case. And if you see the ECQ formula, the formula for optimal order quantity has a square root in it. And what are the implications of square root in terms of what can happen when a demand changes? So if you think about it, if the demand quadruples, it becomes 4 times of what it is. What will happen is it will result in doubling of order quantity simply because of the square root of 4 is 2. And it will also result in doubling the number of orders and doubling the quantity as such. And that number of orders in the year would get doubled if the demand is quadrupled. On the other hand, the setup cost, which is also in the numerator of the formula, if the setup costs become a fourth of itself, the batch size is really cut to half. So it gives you an idea, if you want to reduce the batch size to half, you would need to reduce the setup cost, which is where a lot of companies would try and put their attention in terms of reducing the ordering cost, reducing the setup costs, so on and so forth. And if you can reduce that to a fourth of its original, then the batch size is actually cut to its half. When we talk about robustness of ECQ, the other thing that about the ECQ that you can see is the total cost is pretty flat at the optimal point. And at that point, which is the total cost, is your minimum at Q star, and the total cost curve is pretty flat. And what do we mean by this? So if we move towards the left, or you move towards the right of Q star, you will actually the costs would actually change by a substantial amount. let's look at how much is that substantial amount in this slide. The annual cost doesn't go much higher than the lowest cost by too much. So it's robust to any misestimations that might result in getting an incorrect Q star. So if you were to misestimate the holding cost or the setup cost, which would result in misestimation of your optimal order quantity, you will have to misestimate it by quite a bit for the annual cost to substantially be higher than what it would have been based on the optimal order quantity. All right, let's look at it from an example and let's try and understand this slightly in a slightly more more details. All right. Okay. Let's apply to see the mechanics of how you would calculate. Okay, so if you guys are not very well versed in terms of the robustness for ECQ, I mean it's these are not typically concepts that you need to be extremely clear with, and it will take some time to be able to go through some associated explanations with it. So don't worry too much about it. Just remember what is Q star. Just remember the formula for Q star in terms of ECQ, the optimal order quantity, and just understand the total cost is represented by a formula called 2DSH, the square root of 2DSH. Understand what is the optimal order quantity. Understand that we are talking about in ECQ is really, it's a trade-off between whether you would want to incur more of holding costs or whether you would incur more of reordering costs. And it's really understanding that trade-off and trying to arrive at that point where you might want to reorder certain things or certain items of your inventory. All right. Okay. Let's apply this to see the mechanics of how you would calculate the ECQ for a particular company, and let's practice this calculation based on this problem that we have here. The annual demand is 10,000 units. The cost to place an order is 10, and every time you place an order, you will incur a cost of you place an order, you incur a cost of $10. The holding cost is 30% of the cost per unit. Obviously, this includes more than the interest of the investment that you will have to carry on the inventory. So it's got a little bit more than that, and that's why it's 30%. The cost per unit is $15. So if what we are going to do here is determine the ECQ. Then we'll go back and check the annual holding cost and this annual setup cost, and then we'll see what we can find there. And you can also check based on the formula that we saw earlier, the total cost, even without calculating the holding costs and setup costs separately. So let's take a quick minute and work through these calculations, and let's try and see what we found when we did this here. So guys, if you, I mean, just note these numbers, try and work through this problem. This is the formula, and let's calculate the ECQ. Let's see. Let's take a couple of minutes and let's try and calculate the ECQ.
Sir, can you show that numbers again?
Yeah. Okay, I think there's a There's a mistake here. This is 10,000 units. I missed out 10 here.
I'm getting 699.20.
Okay. All right. Let's try and see how we've calculated the ECQ.
Sir, I did 2 into 10,000 into 10
Mhm.
divided by 4.5. That means the 30% of 15.
And you have to do a square root of that.
Square root, yes.
Correct. And you're right. This is pretty much what it is. All right. The annual cost for ordering, the number of orders is going to be based on the annual demand. So if 10,000 units is the annual demand, and if you order 211 at a time, it will give you the number of orders. Let's separate this over here, and let's, on the basis of this, the number of orders and multiplying it with the total cost of $10. You can work out the annual cost for ordering a quantity. For holding, you will have to take Q, which is 211, and you would divide that by 2 to get an average. So here we are talking about the holding costs. That will be the number of orders.
Yes, sir, correct. I added one more zero, so that's
It's
why.
a calculation error. Don't worry about the calculation so much.
Yes, sir, yes, sir. 210.81.
Correct. And the number of orders would be 10,000 divided by the ECQ, right? And what would be the holding cost? The annual holding cost is 211 divided by 2. That's the average inventory. Multiply that by 0.3, and you multiply that by $15 of the cost of the item, and that should give you the holding cost. So if you were to work through these numbers, what you would find is the total cost works out to be dollar 948 and some, I think, some decimal number. So that's the number you guys should be getting. Don't worry so much about the calculations. Just think about it from the concept of applying the formula to be able to understand what's the ECQ, what are the number of orders, and what is the holding cost. All right. So I think let's sum it up with some insights from the session. And what you would notice from looking at the calculations for the cost of holding and the cost of ordering are approximately similar to each other in the previous example. That's close to 948, 950 if you have calculated the cost of holding and cost of ordering. So you have 474.75 for the cost of holding, and you have 473.93, that is the cost of ordering. And of course, this is not by accident, because the economic order quantity, or the ECQ that we calculated, is based on trading off both of these costs. So it's the point at which the total cost of ordering for the year and the total cost of ordering, of holding for the year, are almost equal to each other. So that's what we have found. Now, you could use this formula that we looked at earlier for the total cost, and check your workings in terms of finding out what the total cost would be, and you will still find that it would still work out to be exactly the same. So here we have ECQ that is being to calculate how much to order. The other part of the decision for inventory management is going to be when to order, and that involves a concept of a reorder point. and I guess that we'll have to look at it in the next class. So just to kind of put things into perspective, when we are talking about inventory from an operation strategy perspective, we are really looking at understanding two key concepts: how much do you need to order and when do you need to order. These are important because you will need to optimize the costs for your inventory management, for your inventory holding. Typically, when we are looking at from an operation strategy perspective, both of these aspects become important. And it's really a trade-off that we have to understand. So it's ordering costs versus holding costs. And we usually use a very popular model. It's called the economic order quantity to understand how much to order. And for when to order, there's typically a reorder point, which we look at shortly, maybe in the next class. Your formula for your ECQ would be that's the optimal inventory. The Q star is the optimal quantity. It's divided by, it's 2DS. D is the annual demand. S is the setup costs. H are the holding costs. The total annual costs, including ECQ, the total cost will be total cost of Q star would be 2DSH and a square root of that. And we will look at some of the implications in terms of square root and why this is important in terms of determining how much of demand is going to be affected when you order. We looked at the total cost curve. We looked at how Q star being the optimal point for the organization, and anything beyond left or right will incur substantial amount of costs or substantial amount of wastage. We looked at it from an example, and we saw that the holding costs and setup costs were almost coming equal. From a really practical perspective, you will be surprised that how many companies don't really follow this ECQ concept and don't really follow the Q star. And that's really because a lot of assumptions in ECQ might not be very applicable to the real world scenario. But if you still follow ECQ in your practice when you are working on a shop floor, or when you're deciding the operation strategy, you will be able to optimize, if not to the exact Q star point, the total annual cost. It will hopefully be somewhere very, very close to it, and it could probably be plus minus 5 to 7%, which should still be extremely beneficial for your organization. So I think let's stop here, because we have a next concept which will take about at least 15 to 20 minutes, because we will look at another problem in that, and then we'll move on to supply chain from an operation strategy perspective, which we will be covering in the last few classes of this session. So thank you so much. I know you've had a very long day. I will be uploading this presentation also. Just go over this, try and see. You can check a few videos on YouTube. You can also go over some reading materials. You'll find a lot of them on ECQ. But I think at the core of it, if you've kind of followed this class and you've understood it, I think it should be more than enough. Thank you so much, guys. Please work on your assignment. We have another 5-6 sessions to go, so we will be closing this course. So try and submit your assignment before the 16th. It will really help to be updated and be on time with whatever is required from a course perspective.
Sir, attendance.
Sir, some of us joined late.
Yeah.
Due to.
Okay, I have marked Smith Ketan Kumar as absent. Let me know if anyone is present here. Ritvik, Harshad.
Yes, sir. Harshad present.
Okay, Shivam, Shreyas, Nishant.
Sir, I am present. I was in the Flipkart one.
Shreyas, okay. Nishant, Hasnain, Sushant, Surya Kumar. All right.
Sir, Sushant also wrote in a chat box and I am present.
Okay.
Suryakant.
Okay. Got it. So
Thank you,
we
sir.
only have 4 absentees today. Hasnain,
Sir, Smith
Nishant.
has also written in chat box.
Okay. All right. 3 absents: Ritvik, Shivam, Nishant, and Hasnain. Sorry, four people absent. Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great evening ahead. See you on Friday.
Yes, sir. Where are you uploading this PPT?
The same folder, Harshad.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. अरे अंशुल
भिवंडी 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 भिवंडी
भिवंडी
भिवंडी भिवंडी
अरे लोकेशन कंफर्म हो गया?
नहीं
90% कन्फर्म.
90 हाँ मेरे को भी वही लग रहा है भिवंडी जाएगा
तो
शायद।
तुमको क्या आया?
क्या तेरे को क्या आ गया?
तुमका क्या आया?
कंट्रोल करो.
तुमको क्या आया?
तुमको क्या आया? क्या
श्रेयस.
लोकेशन आया?
श्रेयस.
अंशुल भिवंडी.
भिवंडी भिवंडी.
अरे हैदराबाद रखो ना.
ए चल बे अन्ना बोल.
अरे what you guys will do in whole Mumbai in every lifetime, whole lifetime.
हाँ तो
हैदराबाद ना.
Hey, you also.
No.
अरे I am keeping Hyderabad, Baba. Anshul, you
नहीं
come to
नहीं
Hyderabad.
not interested not interested.
Not interested. I am not asking for night.
वो सीधा उधर ही गया उसका.
हैदराबाद एकदम सिटी है भाई. You can enjoy.
चल मुंबई वाला को बोल रहा है हैदराबाद में. चल.
अरे वो देखा ना वो कौन था वो चमन वो गणपति.
क्या रे कैसे?
अरे कैसा अरे उसका नाम क्या था वो कितना तो कुछ तो अलग ही नाम था उसका कुछ तो नाम था और पीछे गणपति.
काय माहिती बाय
Yep. Event.
Aditi, you are going to interview next week.